When it comes to building an investment portfolio, choosing the right ETFs and combining them in the right way is absolutely vital. But there are 14 different equity ETFs on Vanguard's UK website, and there are plenty more elsewhere, so which of these funds are the best? We're going to be going through all of the best funds on the website, whilst discussing the key features that you need to know about all of the funds. We'll also make sure to explain some of the key concepts related to low-cost passive investing, so that you can start to realise why the funds in this video are so good. Using this information, we'll even combine some of these ETFs to make up some great low-cost global portfolios. Sounds like a plan to me. Let's get straight into it. To start us off on our hunt for the best Vanguard ETFs, it makes sense to start with the basics. The easiest route to becoming a low-cost passive investor is by investing in a low-cost, globally diversified portfolio. VWRL, the FTSE All-World ETF, is Vanguard's version of exactly that. It invests in over 3,800 stocks from all over the world, all for the low ongoing cost of just 0.22%. The fund tracks the FTSE All-World Index, which is an index that is made up of large and mid-cap stocks from both the developed and emerging markets. So by investing in this one fund, you would basically be covering the entire global markets, which means that you would earn the returns that the global markets produce. We saw last week that most active managers actually fail to outperform the markets, which means that this fund is going to be producing top-end returns. By covering both the developed and the emerging markets, you've got everything that you need in a global tracker. This diversification across the entire global equity markets means that the individual risk of particular countries or market sectors is minimised. Should the UK, for example, experience a catastrophe that ruins its equity markets, you would not be wiped out, because you'd be diversified across much more than just one country. The fact that you can get all of this diversification for just a 0.22% ongoing charge is the reason that this fund had to be included in this video. It is immense value. Looking at the portfolio data tab, we can visualise the diversification that we just discussed. The US has a massive allocation of around 60% because of the sheer size of the US equity markets, with the other countries having smaller allocations. This is typical of most other global funds because they are typically market cap weighted. This means that countries with the largest market cap get more allocated to them, while smaller countries get a proportionally smaller amount. So VWRL can be used as an all-in-one fund to constitute an entire portfolio, but it can also be used as the heart of other, more complex portfolios. If you believe that a certain country or market sector is going to outperform the global markets, you could combine it with VWRL to create a tilted portfolio. For example, let's say that I think that the UK is going to outperform the global markets. I could, for example, allocate 90% of my investment towards VWRL and allocate the other 10% to a UK-based fund. This would mean that I'm getting more exposure to the UK markets without having to go all in on them, which would be extremely risky. Just bear in mind that portfolio tilts like these are essentially a form of active management, or trying to time a market, which is not always a successful strategy. Remember, I'm not a financial advisor, so please don't take this as advice, but generally, trusting the global markets by replicating them exactly is a well-proven successful strategy. I also just want to mention that another similar fund exists with the ticker symbol VWRP, but it is not available on Vanguard's website. It is essentially the exact same fund, but the dividends are accumulative, rather than distributing as they are in VWRL. An accumulative fund automatically reinvests the dividends back into the fund, instead of paying them out as cash into your investing account. Accumulative funds are often a great choice because it maximises the returns that you get from the fund. But just bear in mind that it does make it more difficult to track your dividends, which you may need to do if you are investing outside of a stocks and shares ISA for tax purposes. All of the ETFs on Vanguard's website are distributing, meaning that you'll get cash paid into your account every few months, which you can choose to either withdraw or reinvest manually. I think it's a good time to remind you guys of this graph, which shows the difference in returns of the S&P 500 from 1960 to 2017, with and without dividends reinvested. Reinvesting dividends boosts your returns massively, so just bear that in mind. But after getting sidetracked with a few investing concepts, I'm sorry, I get carried away, I know. I think it's about time that we move on to the next ETF on this list, which is another fund from the global section. VEVE, the FTSE Developed World ETF, is another great fund that earns a place in a lot of portfolios. The fund invests in over 2,200 stocks and has an even lower ongoing charge of just 0.12%. It tracks the FTSE Developed Index, which invests in both large and mid-cap stocks in the developed markets. Countries that have a relatively high economic growth and economic security are considered to be in the developed markets, which make up around 90% of the global markets that we discussed earlier. The other 10% goes to the emerging markets. but more on that later. You can see from the portfolio data that the allocations are largely similar to VWRL, but some countries are missing, and the remaining ones have a slightly higher allocation. The interesting thing about VEVE, which makes it such a good fund, is that it invests in 90% of the global markets, minus the emerging markets of course. But it does it for a much lower ongoing cost of 0.12%. So some people use this fund instead of VWRL as a cheaper version of a global tracker. Of course, it is not as comprehensive as VWRL as it doesn't include the emerging markets such as China and India, but the ongoing charge is a whole 0.1% less, which is almost halving the costs. But if you don't feel comfortable leaving the emerging markets out of your portfolio, you can combine it with the next fund on our list. VEVE. The FTSE Emerging Markets ETF is the second half of a global market that VEVE does not cover. The fund invests in almost 1,900 stocks, with an ongoing charge of 0.22%, which is notably higher than the Developed World Fund. It of course tracks the FTSE Emerging Index, which is comprised of large and mid-cap stocks from the emerging markets. An emerging market is one that is in the process of becoming a developed market. They are typically more volatile due to uncertainties in their governments or economies. You can see from the portfolio data that the emerging markets are dominated by China, with Taiwan, India and Brazil being a few other key players. It's rare that an investor would invest 100% in the emerging markets due to their increased volatility. The price movements are much more dramatic when compared to the developed markets, and they often don't travel in the same direction either. This was seen in 2021 with VEVE earning around 21% year to date, compared to VFEM, which returned just less than 0%. But of course, this works both ways. Sometimes the emerging markets will have years that far exceed the returns of the developed markets. This is why it can be a good idea to include both the developed and the emerging markets in your portfolio, to ensure that you are globally diversified and that you capture the global market returns. If you're curious as to where the 90% developed markets and 10% emerging market split comes from, you can work it out by looking at each country's allocation in each fund and then comparing it to a global tracker. For example, let's look at the US, which has a 60.1% allocation in VWRL, our global tracker, and 66.9% allocation in the Developed Markets Fund. If we divide these numbers and multiply by 100%, we can see that the developed markets make up 89.8% of the global markets. Alternatively, we can look at China, which has a 3.8% allocation in VWRL and a 37.2% allocation in the Emerging Markets Fund. If we do the same calculation, it turns out that the emerging markets make up 10.2% of the global markets. And would you look at that? 89.8 plus 10.2 equals 100. Perfect. If you were to combine VEVE and VFEM in this way, you'd have a two-fund global portfolio that invests in over 4,100 stocks with an average ongoing charge of 0.13%. So when comparing that to VWRL, you'd be investing in around 300 more stocks, but with an ongoing charge that is 0.09% less. Of course, a two-fund portfolio will be a little bit more effort to manage, as you'd have two funds that you need to invest in each month, and every now and then you may need to rebalance it to make sure that the allocations are on track. But this extra effort could be worth it for the 0.09% saving that you'd make instead of just investing in VWRL. That's a trade-off that you'll have to consider. Before we move on to the next fund, which is a big one, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this sort of content. We've got more simple, passive investing content coming out every single week, so stay tuned for more of that. This next fund absolutely has to be included in the video, as it is the most popular fund on the platform with over $32 billion in assets. VUSA, Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF, is probably the most famous ETF that is available in the UK. The fund invests in just over 500 stocks with an impressively low ongoing charge of just 0.07%, making it the cheapest fund on the site. It tracks the Standard & Poor's 500 index, or S&P 500, which is made up of large cap US stocks. It goes without saying, the S&P 500 is an absolute giant in the investing world. Ever since 1957, when the index first expanded from 90 to 500 companies, the index has annualized inflation-adjusted returns of 6.8%. That level of returns over so long is what makes the S&P 500 so impressive. Many active managers have tried to beat the S&P 500, and many have failed. The portfolio data shows a 100% US allocation as expected, so we'll take a look at the market sector breakdown instead. You can see that the fund is dominated by the information technology sector, which has boomed over the past couple of decades with the like of Apple, Microsoft and Amazon seemingly taking over the world. The other market sectors have a more even distribution. The S&P 500 alone accounts for around 75% of US equities, with the other 25% being mid and small cap stocks. This means that you can invest in a large portion of the US markets, the world's largest equity markets, for just a 0.07% ongoing charge. Many investors use this fund on its own to constitute an entire investing portfolio, as it is a strategy that many famous investors, including Warren Buffett, have actually recommended themselves. However, for what it's worth, I think that this is quite a risky strategy. Betting entirely on the US markets goes against the globally diversified approach that we discussed earlier. If the US markets were to decline over the next few decades, your returns would likely also follow. If you diversify across the entire world though, you are mitigating that risk. So I think that this fund actually works best as a complementary fund, as in, maybe it should just be used to make up the US part of your portfolio, alongside some other funds. That, or it could be combined with another global fund, such as VWRL, to give you a global portfolio with a small tilt towards the US markets. However, please remember that I am not a financial advisor. These are just my opinions and they should not be taken as advice. If it's advice that you're looking for, then you should seek that from a professional. But regardless of what I think, this fund tracks the S&P 500, which has had proven results for over 100 years. And it's hard to argue against that. Remember that if you are investing on a different platform, an accumulating version of this fund may be available. It is known as VUAG, so keep an eye out for that. Next up, we're heading back to the global section to cover a new ETF that was released last year that blows the other funds out of the park when it comes to size. V3AM, the ESG Global All-Cap ETF, is Vanguard's ESG version of a global tracker. The fund invests in over 5,800 stocks for an ongoing charge of 0.24%. It tracks the FTSE Global All Cap Choice Index, which includes large, mid, and small cap stocks. The key difference is that the stocks in this fund are actually screened against ESG criteria. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Only the companies that score well in these three factors are included, meaning that the fund is generally considered to be sustainable by only focusing on companies that are working towards a positive future. The portfolio data shows that the fund has a very similar composition to most other global trackers, with the percentages for each country varying just a little. So this is another example of an all-in-one global fund. By investing in this one fund, you've basically got an entire global portfolio. In fact, it could be argued that the diversification is even more comprehensive than that of VWRL, because it includes small cap stocks, which VWRL does not. This explains where the extra 2,000 stocks came from. It's also worth mentioning that small cap stocks, on average, actually produce higher returns than large cap stocks, as explained by the size factor, so including them in a portfolio is key. One of the potential downsides with V3AM is that it is the highest ongoing charge out of any of the passive funds on Vanguard's site, at 0.24%. At the end of the day, 0.24% is not that bad, but it will put some people off when you could just invest in VWRL, which is 0.02% cheaper. However, it is worth considering that the added costs stem from the inclusion of small cap stocks, 2,000 of them in fact, and from the ESG screening of each company. Ultimately, it comes down to whether or not you think that these extra benefits are worth it for the slightly higher ongoing charge. But either way, this fund is still up there with the best of the best on the platform. As we've just included one of the more expensive funds on the platform, I think it's only fair that we move on to one of the cheapest next. VUKE, the FTSE 100 ETF, is the staple Vanguard fund for investing in the UK equity markets. The fund invests in just over 100 stocks with a nice and low ongoing charge of just 0.09%. The fund tracks the FTSE 100 index, which is made up of large cap UK stocks. Of course, this fund is close to all of our hearts, as the FTSE 100 is often used as a benchmark to see how the UK equity markets are doing. In comparison to VUSA, the market sector breakdown is quite different, with financials and consumer staples topping the table, and technology actually down at the bottom. The FTSE 100 makes up around 77% of the UK markets, similar to the S&P 500 in the US, so it is often used to add UK exposure to a global portfolio. Alternatively, you could combine it with other global funds to create a portfolio that tilts towards the UK markets, if you think that they're going to have a strong future. But if you're not happy with just the FTSE 100, you can combine it with the next fund, the MID, the FTSE 250 ETF. This fund invests in around 250 stocks with an ongoing charge of just 0.1%. It tracks the FTSE 250 index, which is essentially the next 250 largest UK stocks after the FTSE 100, so they are in fact mid-cap stocks. The FTSE 250 makes up around 15% of UK markets, meaning you can combine it with the FTSE 100 to make up around 92% of UK markets. The other 8% goes to small cap stocks, but unfortunately there's not a Vanguard ETF on the site that covers that yet. So if you do want to combine these funds and top them up to 100%, you'd be looking at a ratio of around 83% to the FTSE 100 and 17% to the FTSE 250. Just remember that investing in only these two funds would be considered to be quite risky, because you would not be globally diversified. If the UK markets were to have an awful decade or so of returns, you'd feel the full force of that. Instead, as with many of the other ETFs in this video, combining them with some other funds probably works best. Now, that's it for all of the funds in this video. If there are any that you think I've missed, or if you want to see some more examples of some Vanguard portfolios, just let me know in the comments. Also, I do understand that this has been a long old video, so if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for your time. In fact, comment the word legend below and I'll tell you personally that you are a legend. I hope that you found this to be a useful overview of the best Vanguard ETFs on the platform, and I hope that you picked up some decent investing tips along the way. If you want to pick up even more investing tips, then I recommend you subscribe to the channel, and you should probably watch this video here too. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.